Tonight, all about the law, and that means a lot to talk about the Russia probe. We've got a former federal prosecutor here to look at the very latest developments, and there were many today. Plus, the case against Harvey Weinstein. Attorney, he's going after accusers. The question is, will that strategy work in light of the current climate that we find ourselves in today? Then, legal woes. They're piling up for the drug companies. A lot of lawsuits over the opioid crisis and whether the manufacturers are the ones to blame. Our panel of attorneys here to hash all that out and more. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us. As usual, a lot of big developments in the Mueller probe. President Trump ratcheting up his attacks and new reports about Trump's handling of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and how that is now a bigger part of the investigation than we once thought. Overnight at a rally in Nashville, the president riling up the crowd about a Spygate theory.
So how do you like the fact they had people infiltrating our campaign? Can you imagine? Can you imagine?
President Trump pushing the idea without any evidence that the FBI infiltrated his campaign with a spy to help Hillary Clinton win the election. But earlier, one GOP lawmaker saying the FBI did nothing wrong when it sent an informant to speak to Trump campaign advisors about their contacts with Russians. Republican Congressman Trey Gowdy telling Fox News,
I am even more convinced that the FBI did exactly what my fellow citizens would want them to do when they got the information they got, and that it has nothing to do with Donald Trump.
As chairman of the House Oversight Committee, he was in a classified briefing last week hearing what the FBI based their questioning of the Trump campaign advisors on. Other top lawmakers heard the same information in that briefing, and none has criticized the FBI's methods since. But the president playing up Gowdy's other comment to CBS.
I would be frustrated, too. That's how I read that, is Senator Sessions, why didn't you tell me this before I picked you? There are lots of really good lawyers in the country. He could have picked someone else.
The president tweeting out Gowdy's words and then adding, quote, and I wish I did. This comes as the New York Times reports that the president asked Jeff Sessions to take back his recusal from the Russia investigation at a meeting in Mar-a-Lago last year. Sessions denied his request to oversee the investigation again. So those are the nuts and bolts when it comes to Trump and Sessions. So I wanted to give you some more details in the timeline as spelled out by the Times today. While Sessions visited Florida and was told by Trump to take over the Russia probe, even though he had already recused himself, it followed 2 days of silent treatment from the president. Now, Trump wouldn't take the Attorney General's important phone calls about the travel ban. So Sessions, he had to get on a plane and fly down to Mar-a-Lago, and Trump then confronted him about Russia, not the ban whatsoever. Now, special counsel Bob Mueller, he's looking into all that and the larger question of obstruction. Also, in the piece that I just played for you, Trey Gowdy debunked Spygate. Now, he's not the only one. Shep Smith on Fox News, of all places, doing the same.
The president claims the special counsel investigating Russia election interference and potential collusion with Team Trump will be meddling in our elections. There is nothing to indicate that's true. As for the rest of the tweet, documents show there are people who've registered as Democrats on the special counsel's team, but Robert Mueller is a Republican, and so is President Trump's Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who appointed Mueller. President Trump has also claimed the feds spied on his campaign with an informant. The president calls it Spygate. Fox News can confirm it is not. Fox News knows of no evidence to support the president's claim that lawmakers from both parties say using an informant to investigate suspected ties to Russia is not spying. It's part of the normal investigative process.
Good for him, and you can actually say fair and balanced. So here to discuss all of that and more, former federal prosecutor Elie Honig. Always, Elie, appreciate the time. So there's a lot to unpack here, and also another story in Lower New York today I'll get to as well. But first, let's start off with what we heard with Spygate and the president reiterating it last night again. As a guy who understands how these investigations work and what the FBI does to secure information, give context to the public, not just how common this is, but how it's almost malpractice if they didn't, considering they warned the Trump campaign a half a dozen times that the Russians were trying to compromise the election, and they got basic radio silence as a consequence.
Yeah, good to be here, Richard. Thanks for having me. So first of all, what President Trump and Rudy Giuliani and his team are calling spies, I think we all now know that's a sensationalized term. What they're really called in law enforcement is confidential informants. Confidential informants, first of all, are extremely common. I assure you, Rudy Giuliani himself, when he was making his name back at the Southern District, used dozens, if not hundreds, of confidential informants. Confidential informants are legal. There is no legal problem with using informants. And third, confidential informants are often the best investigative way to get into a complex or closed organization. So when the FBI learned that there would be efforts by Russians to infiltrate the campaign, the Trump people, their response, if they weren't involved, should have just been, thank you, please come in, do whatever you need to do to keep these Russian emissaries from infiltrating our campaign or infiltrating the campaign for America as a whole. So I think what we're really seeing here is a continuation of Trump's strategy of, put aside the facts, put aside reality, come up with a sensational spin and a buzzword like spy, and keep on repeating it, even as members of his own party are starting to say, as we just heard from Trey Gowdy and from Fox News, that there's really nothing here.
In its assault, let's be clear, on the Justice Department, the rule of law, and the top law enforcement officer in the country, Jeff Sessions, who I've got issues with, I'll get into later on in the program, but nonetheless, have you ever heard of somebody who's recused themselves rightly by every legal standard and author that I can think of here, that he had to because of his involvement during the campaign, and then asked to unrecuse himself, if that's even grammatically correct? I've never heard of this. Have you?
No, I'm not sure that's a thing to unrecuse yourself. If you recuse yourself, it's because there's a conflict or a potential conflict or an appearance of a conflict. I've been recused off of matters. I've had supervisors recused off of matters. I don't think I've ever seen anybody unrecused off of matters. Perhaps you can't blame President Trump. He doesn't have a law degree for not quite understanding that. But what I think a big question with Attorney General Sessions is, when is he going to say enough is enough? I mean, this is completely unprecedented to see a president openly belittling, demeaning, undermining an attorney general. I mean, even with today's tweet, I wish I picked somebody else. I bet he does wish he picked somebody else, because Sessions doing the right thing and recusing himself, having been a campaign surrogate for Trump, led to Rosenstein, which led to Mueller. So I'm sure the president does wish that he had chosen somebody else.
But then the politics turn out, if he actually followed through and and apparently last year, Sessions offered his resignation, for which Trump didn't accept, but he keeps beating him up every chance he can in front of a camera, let alone behind closed doors. They couldn't get another guy confirmed to Attorney General, given all the facts that surround this. So, Ellie, my question is, Mueller, and I don't think a lot of us put our arms around it, maybe you did, this is part of the obstruction probe. The idea that you're trying to have the Attorney General be your personal counsel here and work on your behalf instead of the pursuit of justice and the law, Mueller says that's part of obstruction too. How significant is that?
Yeah, look, it's big, because the obstruction of justice case, if there is one to be made, is all going to come down to intent. And we already have the firing of Comey, and we have the president's statements at the time that he was doing it to ease the pressure on Russia. We appear to have the president having a hand in Don Jr.'s crafting of that misleading statement after Donald Trump Jr. had that mysterious hotel meeting with the Russian emissaries. And now we have this. And you're right, Richard. The Attorney General of the United States does not serve the President of the United States. The Attorney General of the United States serves the American people and the Constitution. And to try to use the Attorney General to not only serve the President's purposes, but to do that by stopping or shutting down an investigation, I think really will bolster the intent claim on an obstruction of justice charge.
Now, let's say Trump makes a move on him, or Sessions just says enough is enough. I have some shred of dignity here. I'm not going to take it anymore. What happens to Sessions at that point? Is he considered attorney-client privilege with the president? You just said it himself. The Attorney General is not the personal attorney of the president. Does he become part of the Mueller probe?
Yeah, so look, that's a big question. Would Sessions become a witness? Would he cooperate? I don't see any reason why he wouldn't. I mean, there's two questions to me. There's will he and can he, right? Will he? I think he might well. I mean, this is where, I'll tell you from my background doing mafia cases, This is the kind of situation where you pick off cooperators, where you have somebody who's been discarded by the family, written off as disloyal. The mobsters call it put on the shelf. And Trump has kind of put Sessions on the shelf here. So when you get someone who feels that way, they're sort of ripe to flip. There's a separate question that I think you raised about, would this be privileged? Would the conversations between the Attorney General and the President be privileged? I think that's a tricky call. I would start with what I said before. The Attorney General is not the representative of the President. The President has his own representatives. And I'd also look back at history. If you look back at Watergate, John Dean was not Attorney General, but he was White House counsel to President Nixon. And I would argue that's clearly a step closer in terms of an attorney-client relationship. And John Dean, of course, cooperated against President Nixon. So if that's the precedent, I don't see any reason why Jeff Sessions couldn't cooperate here.
So we talk about this in buckets, the Mueller probe. You have obstruction, which you discussed, there's collusion. And then there's this thing that got born out of the Stormy Daniels case here and how this thing has evolved, obviously, with Michael Cohen. Well, Michael Cohen was in Lower New York today, once again in court, and he and the Avenatti show, seriously, that should be reality TV. But I want to read, or play for you what Michael Avenatti said, because apparently there's audio recordings here. Take a listen to Mr. Avenatti.
Mr. Cohen and his attorney, Mr. Ryan, should release all of those audio recordings to the American people and to Congress so that they can be heard by all and people can make their own determinations as to their importance relating to the president and what he knew.
Obviously, Ellie, there's a lot of theatrics here going on, but listen, I'm as guilty as anybody. I dismissed this thing as a sideshow a few months ago, and look what it's already created. What's going on here and what happened today in New York?
Yeah, so I heard somebody, I can't take credit for this, but I heard somebody compare Michael Avenatti to Jose Canseco, the old baseball player who was sort of the first person who came out with all these allegations that all these other players were using steroids. You want to write them both off as, attention seekers and non-credible, but it turned out almost everything Jose Canseco said had come to pass, and it's looking that way to some extent with Michael Avenatti. He is suggesting in that recording that there may be there may be tapes out there of the president speaking with Michael Cohen. There may be a privilege issue on that, unless they're discussing a crime. But what's going on down in the courthouse in Lower Manhattan is the parties are sort of wrangling over the details of who is going to go through this mass quantity, millions, they're saying, of documents, emails, and shredded documents, which apparently are being reassembled, and decide whether they're privileged. Is that going to be Cohen's people? Is that going to be Judge Jones? And of course, whoever's making that or at least that initial determination, is pretty important, because I think two sets of lawyers can look at the same document, and whether they decide it's privileged or not sometimes tends to track their own client's interests.
Finally, before I let you go, Ellie, we've got less than a minute, and we can trace it back to tonight here to say, Ellie said it first, give people at home, as it relates with the Mueller probe, what you think will be the next shoe that will drop.
The next big battle is going to be whether Trump talks. And Trump and his team are saying, well, we're not going to agree to this. We're not going to agree to an interview. Ultimately, he doesn't have the choice. Robert Mueller is the one who holds that power. Mueller can issue a subpoena. That's the hard way. And if Trump doesn't want to do an interview, they'll do it that way. And then Trump's going to be in that, does he take the fifth or not stage, which is going to be a really interesting moment. But I think there will be more indictments coming and potentially trials of Manafort ahead. But Mueller is by no means done, and Trump is by no means out of hot water.
Ellie Honig, as always, my friend, thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard. Anytime.
All right, everybody, coming up next, we're going to pivot to politics. A lot of it happened today. We'll take a look at Trump's response to Roseanne's racist tweet. And if you missed it today, he said something. And even for me, I couldn't believe he went there. We'll get into that and much more after this.